Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my Victober TBR / pile of possibilities. Today I'm going to be talking through some of the books I might read this Victober. So, if you don't know what Victober is, it is a month-long readathon all about reading Victorian literature in the month of October. I will leave my announcement video and the announcement video of the other 9 hosts down below in the description. Yes, we have 10 hosts this year and 10 challenges because it is the 10th of October, which is very exciting. And I have picked out a lot of books that I might read this Victober. I'll be honest with you, my TBR / pile of possibilities is way too long. I have like 13 priority books and 9 like possible bonus extra books, which is 22 books, and I think I will be lucky if I manage to read 10. To be honest, I'll be lucky if I manage to read like 7 or 8, because October is looking very, very, very busy for me work-wise, which is a bit of a shame with Victober, but there we go. I sadly think this is not going to be one of my most productive Victobers, but there we go. I also usually go up to 3 videos a week in Victober rather than 2, which I am hoping to still do, but I feel like it's going to be slightly less doable this year just because of the way my freelance work schedule has turned out, and so we will see about that. Basically, as I said, I have lots of books on this pile of possibilities / TBR, and I'm not going to end up reading most of them, but I will read some of them, and I'm excited about all of them. And I also feel like I haven't been reading enough Victorian literature so far this year, and I'm feeling really in the mood I'm really excited about Victorian literature at the moment, so maybe this will be like my October and November TBR, and I'll just carry on Victober into November and read some of these books that month, so we will see. Anyway, that was a very long ramble, so let me get into the challenges and what I'm going to be reading for them. So, Kate's challenge, the first challenge of the 10th of October, is to read a Victorian book where friendship is featured, and I have one main pick for this and then one possible alternative pick for this. So my priority book for this prompt, one I'll definitely be reading in October, is Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. This is a reread for me, and I'm going to be buddy reading it with Emily from Novelle Novels. I'm not actually going to read this physical edition. I think I'm probably going to listen to it on audiobook because I've read Shirley twice before, both times physically, and I really enjoy rereading on audiobook. I'm really looking forward to reading this one. It's a really interesting tale of the friendship between a woman called Caroline and a woman called Shirley, with a lot of interesting detail about resistance to changes in manufacturing in the early 19th century. This is a historical novel, so written in the mid-19th century, set in the early 19th century, and I really like it. Looking forward to reading that again. And then my other pick for this prompt that I'm probably not going to get to, but you never know, is Moonfleet by James Mead Faulkner. This is a late Victorian novel about smuggling, I think, and Kate mentioned this in her announcement video and mentioned a sort of significant friendship within it, and then like 2 days after I'd watched that, I saw this in a secondhand bookshop and felt that I therefore had to buy it. So, you know, maybe I'll read this Victober, maybe I'll read this later in the year, we will see. Then my challenge this Victober is to read a work of Victorian literature that is not a novel, so that could be a play, a short story, a poem, or a work of non-fiction. And I have quite a few things picked out for this prompt, partly because the things I have picked out for this prompt are quite short, and partly because I like the idea of reading a play, some short stories, some poetry, and a work of non-fiction. So a play I'm hoping to read this Victober is Alan's Wife by Elizabeth Robbins and Florence Bell, which is a short one-act play which I think looks at the position of women within Victorian society, possibly at divorce, but I can't quite remember. It's very short. I found a place I can read it online, and I'd be really interested to read it, especially because I've read quite a lot of Victorian plays, but there aren't very many Victorian plays that I have found that are by women. I think I've only read sort of one by Ouida, and all of the other Victorian plays I've read have been by men, so I'm looking forward to reading this one. And then for short stories, I think I'm going to try Bram Stoker's The Burial of the Rats. This is a little Penguin classic that is only sort of 150 pages, with I think 5 stories in. The only thing I've read by Bram Stoker before was Dracula, which I read when I was 17 several times because I was studying it and I hated it, and I feel like I would kind of be interested to reread it now, but I think maybe I'll try something else by Bram Stoker first, and these short stories should be interesting. When it comes to poetry, I'm hoping to read A Minor Poet and Other Verse by Amy Levy. I really like Amy Levy's novels. I think she's a great writer, and I'm excited to try her poetry. I've read a little bit of her poetry before, but not a full collection. And then for my non-fiction, I have this. This is tavern singing in early Victorian London, the diaries of Charles Rice for 1840 and 1850. So these are the diaries from the Victorian period of someone who I think worked at the British Museum and in his spare time was a singer in London's taverns and made money that way, and this is his diary, and I think that'll be fascinating. I stumbled across this when I was book shopping in Hay on Wye the other week. I think this will be quite different and quite fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. Those are my priority picks for my challenge, but I think it is possible I might read some other poetry, and I do have 2 other things that I am considering reading. So one thing I would like to read in October, but to be honest I think I'll probably end up reading in November, is this. This is The Gothic Tales of Sheridan Le Fanu, a really nice edition from the British Library with several Gothic tales by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. I love Sheridan Le Fanu a lot. I think he's a fantastic writer. I have loved all the novels and short stories I've read by him so far, and I haven't read any of these short stories before, so I'm looking forward to all of these. And then the other thing I'd really like to read in October, but to be honest, I think I'm probably actually not going to manage to get to until November, is a play called The Black Doctor by Ira Aldridge. This is a play that I heard about while reading a history non-fiction book, and it sounded really interesting, and so I wanted to read it, but I can't find it anywhere online. The only way I can read it is if I go to the British Library and check it out and read it at the British Library, and I'm just not sure whether or not I'll have time to have like a British Library afternoon in October, so we'll see. So Ira Aldridge, he was a black man born free in the US, and he moved to Britain and settled in Britain, became an actor and a playwright. And The Black Doctor is a play that he adapted from a French play. He adapted it into a different version for the British stage, and one of the kind of main things he did in adapting it was to make the main character, who is a black doctor, much more sympathetic than he had been in the French version, which is obviously really interesting historically, and I'd be kind of fascinated to read this play. Also, I am kind of always on the lookout for Victorian writers of colour writing in Britain, and they are very hard to find, so when I heard about Ira Aldridge, I really wanted to try and read a play that he had written or adapted, but as I said, this is quite hard to get hold of. I can only read it at the British Library, so whether or not I read it in Victober, we will see, but you know, I might try. Marissa's challenge is to read a work of Victorian literature where a character experiences a change in class status. So one thing I will definitely be reading for this, my sort of priority read for this challenge, is The Hand of Ethelberta by Thomas Hardy. I'm currently taking part in Jen the Librarian's Thomas Hardy read along, where we're reading all of Thomas Hardy's books in publication order. I've been loving it so far, and I'm really excited to reread The Hand of Ethelberta because I haven't read it for the best part of a decade. I'm hoping to get an audiobook of it and listen to it and really enjoy it. The Hand of Ethelberta is a really interesting Thomas Hardy novel that is about a woman called Ethelberta who came from a really working class background, but did well in school, became a governess, married the son of the family she was working for, therefore was elevated in society quite a lot, and now her husband is dead and she is a widow of some consequence and wealth, but she's come like a very long way from her origins in life, and therefore her immediate family's sort of circumstances are incredibly different to her own, and the book kind of goes on from there, and there's a lot of stuff about class and changing class position in it, and it's just great. It's really, really great. Then there were 2 other things I would really love to read for this prompt, but I don't imagine I'm going to have time, but you never know. One is Demos by George Gissing. I don't know too much about Demos, except that its subtitle is A Story of English Socialism, and I just feel that knowing George Gissing, the chance of this book involving a character changing in class status is really, really high, because that's the kind of thing George Gissing likes to write about. So I'm pretty sure, I'm like 90% sure this book would count for this challenge. I've been meaning to read this for ages. I love George Gissing. I'm always keen to read more by him, and I'm sure this will be really interesting. And then another book I am excited to read soon is Diana of the Crossways by George Meredith, who is a Victorian author I really like. And Diana of the Crossways is his novel, his sort of new woman novel about Caroline Norton, who was a real figure from slightly earlier in the period than when this was written. Caroline Norton and her husband got divorced at a point when it was very unusual for people to get divorced, and I think this book is going to look at like the social stigma around her divorce, which I think would kind of fit in with this challenge. I'm very excited to read this because I really like George Meredith and I'm meaning to read this for ages. Whether or not I get to it in Victober, we'll see. Also, this physical edition is very beautiful but very old and slightly falling apart, so I may end up reading this on ebook. We'll see. Then Roz's challenge is to see how many times you can spot signs of the British Empire in your Victober reading, and I haven't picked out a specific book for this challenge because I feel like this is something that will end up running through all of the books I read, and I think I will just look out for this as I go. I'm sure some will end up being more relevant to this challenge than others, but I haven't sort of picked out a specific book for this. Then Elizabeth's challenge is to read a work by an underrated Victorian woman writer. Obviously, I've already mentioned Amy Levy and Elizabeth Robbins and Florence Bell, so they would count, but I do have some other things for this prompt as well. So the group read this year for Victober is Hester by Margaret Oliphant, which would definitely count for this prompt, and I'm so looking forward to rereading this. Again, I think though I have a physical copy, I'm going to listen to this one on audiobook. I love Hester. I read it 5 years ago and just fell in love with it, and I'm so excited to reread it. It's a fascinating tale of the complex relationship between a young woman called Hester and her older relative, Miss Catherine, who runs a bank. And then another book I'm going to be reading for this challenge, which I'm actually going to be buddy reading with Elizabeth, whose challenge it is The Vicar of Wrexhill by Frances Trollope. I don't know too much about this book, but I've read 2 books by Frances Trollope before and really enjoyed them, and I'm looking forward to reading more by her. And I always find Victorian novels about like church politics quite interesting, which I assume this will probably have a bit of. Frances Trollope, if you don't know, is the mother of Anthony Trollope, and she was a great novelist too. So yeah, looking forward to that one. And then one very short thing I've been meaning to read for ages is The Woman Who Didn't by Victoria Cross, which is the pen name of Annie Sophie Corey. This is like only 150 pages and I've got a digital copy, and I meant to read it like 2 years ago and didn't, so I think it's about time that I do. This is a short New Woman novella that was written as a response to a different New Woman novel called The Woman Who Did, which I had problems with. I found it fascinating, but I had some problems with it, so I'm kind of fascinated to read The Woman Who Didn't and see what that is all about. And then, you know, because I haven't got enough books for this prompt, I do also have on my physical TBR A Beleaguered City by Margaret Oliphant. Maybe 2 Margaret Oliphants in one Victober is too much, but also this is very short, and I have been meaning to read it. And it is set in a small French town full of ghosts, so, you know, that does feel very spooky and appropriate for the end of October and Halloween, so maybe I will read this later in the month. And maybe I could actually count this for Roy's challenge to read a work of Victorian fantasy. I hadn't really thought of that. Are ghost stories fantasy? Maybe not, maybe. Anyway, it's fine. It's fine. I have other things for that challenge too. And then finally, it occurred to me, I have here on my shelves a Victorian literature TBR jar, where I have a list of a bunch of Victorian books that I want to read, but I don't own physical copies of, to prompt me to pick them up. And I haven't used it as much this year as I wanted to. And it occurred to me that a lot of the books listed in this TBR jar are books by underrated Victorian women writers. So I thought maybe I would pick something out of this TBR jar. I mean, I know my TBR for Victober is already ridiculously long, but yes, indeed. Here we have Her Mother's Darling. Is this by Dinah Mullet-Craik? It might be. Is it by someone else? Oh no, it's not Dinah Mullet-Craik. This is a Charlotte Riddell novel. Interesting. So I'm going to put this on my Victober TBR. I'm almost certainly not going to read it because this TBR is so long, but maybe this will prompt me to read it in November. Charlotte Riddell is another really fantastic, underrated Victorian woman writer. I read her book A Struggle for Fame a couple of years ago and loved it. And I'm really excited to read more by her. I can't remember what Her Mother's Darling is about and why I put it in my list of Victorian books to read, but I did, so I'm excited for it. There we go. Okay, Hannah's challenge is to read a Victorian work that discusses education, and I expect some of the books I've mentioned already will discuss education, but I have picked out one book specifically for this, and that is The Adventures of Mr. Verdant Green by Cuthbert Bede, which is a pseudonym for Edward Bradley, and this is a comic novel about a first-year student at Oxford, and I found an audiobook of it, and it's not very long, and I think it'll be quite different and a bit of a change of pace because it's comic, so I think this would be a good fun one to pick up in Victober. Then Jess's challenge is to step back in time time and read a Victorian work set in a different era. So Shirley, as I mentioned earlier, is set in a different time period to the time period that it's written. And I'm also this Victober going to be rereading A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, which is set in the 1780s and 90s during the French Revolution. I've read this many times before, but I'm going to be rereading it in Victober. It is the October pick for the historical fiction book club that I run over on Patreon. For that book club, we typically, I would say, read books written more recently, set in the past, but it is fun for Victober to read a Victorian book set before the Victorian period, and I'm really looking forward to rereading A Tale of Two Cities. It hasn't been that long since I last reread it. I guess I reread it like the middle of last year for the Mega Dickens read-along. But because I was doing it for the Mega Dickens read-along, which was a read-along where we were reading all of Dickens's books in publication order, I read it like in the midst of a lot of other Dickens. And A Tale of Two Cities is not my favourite Dickens book by quite a long way. Like, it's quite far down the list for me. But I think that's partly because it's a very different Dickens book, and especially reading it amongst the rest of Dickens, there were just lots of things that I felt were missing from it. Whereas I feel like if I read it on its own, rather than like back to back with lots of other Dickens books, I might judge it less harshly, and might like get the things out of it that are really good, because I do think there are some fantastic things about it. But yeah, anyway, that's a tangent, but I'm looking forward to reading this in October. Then Milena's challenge is to spin a digital colour wheel and pick a Victorian book with a cover that primarily features that colour. And I very handily got black, which is a very good cover to have for classics. You know, 3 books that I've just mentioned in this video have black covers. You know, we have Demos, we have A Tale of Two Cities, we have A Beleaguered City. And I will definitely be reading A Tale of Two Cities, and I might read one of these, so I think I'm fine. Then Roy's challenge is to read a work of Victorian fantasy, which I think is such a fun challenge and I'm really excited for. I have to say that when I initially started planning out my TBR, I had like 7 books for this challenge, and then I was like, no, there's absolutely no way I'm gonna get to read all of these in Victober, and I have trimmed it down to 2. 1 priority and 1 like secondary priority, although actually I feel like maybe my priority is the other way around to how I've put them. But anyway, I've written down here that my priority is The Great God Pan, which I have a copy of here. This is a book by Arthur Machen, a late Victorian book that is, I think, a sort of work of fantastical horror. And yeah, I kind of don't want to read the back of the book because, you know, the backs of classics often spoil them, but I've heard good things about Arthur Machen from Roy, and I thought this would be interesting, so I'm looking forward to this. And the other one I'd like to read is, I'm not sure if it's Fantasies or Fantasties by George MacDonald, but this was on my Victober TBR like a couple of years ago, and I didn't read it, and I have a mean to read it ever since, and I would really like to. I have read one of George MacDonald's realist books, but I haven't read any of his fantasy. Or his children's fairy tales, and I would really like to because I always hear great things about him, so I'm looking forward to reading Fantasies. Actually, maybe I will try and read both of these because they're both quite short. Like, I think both of them are only about 200 pages, so I could probably read them in Victober, couldn't I? We'll see how this goes. Finally, the 10th challenge for Victober, Catherine's challenge, is to read a Victorian book that has a connection to Jane Austen. So I think Shirley by Charlotte Bronte would count for this because it's set during Jane Austen's time. But I also thought I would use this prompt to fit in my Anthony Trollope books for the month because I love Anthony Trollope a lot. I've been reading my way through all of his books. I'm really hoping I will finish reading all of his books by the end of this year. I'm nearly there. I've only got a few left. And Anthony Trollope is an author who always reminds me of Jane Austen, but also he really loves Jane Austen. He thought very, very highly of her books. So I feel like Anthony Trollope is a good author to have for this challenge. And my sort of top pick, my main Anthony Trollope book for October is this. This is The McDermotts of Ballycloran, which I'm buddy reading with Faith from Faith and Books, and I'm really looking forward to reading this. This is one of Anthony Trollope's books that is set in Ireland, and in fact, I think it might be his first novel. Yeah, it is. It's his debut novel. So that's kind of exciting. Is it exciting? It is exciting. Do I think it's going to be his best? Possibly not. I think I've read his second and third novels. I think his second and third novels are The Kellys and the O'Kellys and La Vendée. I think that's right. I might have missed one. They might be number 2 and 4. But those 2 books, though I enjoyed them, would be like definitely further down my Anthony Trollope ranking. So I'm not necessarily expecting this to be his best, but I am really excited for it, and I do love Anthony Trollope, so I think this will be a really interesting read. And the other Anthony Trollope book I've got out from the library, which I might get around to reading in October, is The Landleaguers, which is another of his books set in Ireland, actually, and this was his last novel. And in fact, I think it might be unfinished. So I'm kind of quite keen to make sure this isn't the Anthony Trollope book I end my Anthony Trollope reading with, because I feel like that would be a little bit sad. I'd kind of like to finish it earlier. What I don't know is how unfinished this is. Like, I don't know if it's like a Mystery of Edwin Drood level of unfinished, where it's like halfway through and very disappointing, or if it's like a Wives and Daughters level of unfinished where there's only like a chapter missing and it's fine. Okay, I've done some quick research. It looks like he wrote about 5/6 of it. Like, there were meant to be 60 chapters and there are 11 chapters missing. So it's quite near the end, I guess. So I feel like that is a relatively frustrating level of unfinished, but possibly not as frustrating as The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which is halfway through. So we'll see. Anyway, this has been a long old ramble about some books I may or may not read in Victober. As I said, there is absolutely no way I'm going to get through all of these books. And because I have a very busy October work-wise, I think I will struggle to get through half of them, to be honest, but I may continue Victober into November because that would also be nice. As I said, I think I might struggle to get up to 3 videos every week in Victober. I think especially in the second half of October with work, I think I might not manage that. I usually try to, but I just think I'm not going to be able to do that this year. Or maybe I will, but I also would like to do some live reading sprints, and I think some weeks may need to choose between doing a bonus live reading sprint or a bonus third video. But anyway, yes, I will try and do some reading sprints at some point during Victober. I think I'll probably do them a bit like I did them last year, where they were relatively spontaneous depending on my workload of an evening. But I will try and do like one a week-ish. That is the end of this very rambly TBR/pile of possibilities. Do let me know down in the comments, are you going to be taking part in Victober? What are you planning to read? What are you looking forward to? I'm looking forward to all of these books. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.